Donc, ça c'est moi, quand j'étais plus jeune. Une bonne gueule. Je dis ça parce que si vous voulez voir les slides, je les ai déjà mis sur SlideShare et puis j'ai déjà tweeté. Il y a un lien vers les slides si ça vous intéresse. Moi-même, je viens de monter une boîte en avril à Zurich avec un ami, avec Jordi. Bon, on est déjà 3 entre-temps, on fait du web comme tout le monde, Modern Web Applications. Et moi, ça fait environ 2 ans que j'ai switché gentiment de PHP vers JavaScript. En fait, il y a 2 ans, j'ai fait mon dernier gros bout de PHP et puis j'ai commencé à faire plus du JavaScript. Et ça fait 2 ans que je fais plus que ça. Et puis je suis assez content comme ça. Et puis les 2 autres, il faut encore des maintenant, avant de parler de Backbone.js, si vous voulez savoir plus de choses sur nous, vous pouvez demander après, je pense que c'est pas très intéressant. Avant de parler de Backbone.js, je pense qu'on va juste parler très rapidement de la classical inheritance en JavaScript, donc la façon dont les classes sont implémentées on peut implémenter les classes en JavaScript parce que Backbone l'utilise, et je pense que c'est quand même intéressant d'avoir vite vu le concept qu'on verra après tout le temps dans le code. Donc, ce que le langage nous donne de manière native, je ne vais pas rester longtemps en français, c'est...
Vas-y, switch.
Ouais. Okay, so we have... much better. So, do you all understand English? Of course. Yeah. So we have these things called constructor functions in JavaScript, which are basically just regular functions. There's nothing special about them. And like you can have an animal, which will be our class, and then in the constructor function you can, for example, set this name to name or unknown if no name is given. And that's basically it. And then you have the prototype, which is nothing else than an object, just a regular object which you can assign to the prototype of this constructor function, and in there you can define class methods. Like, for example, the say function, which will log the name of our animal we have. So that's what's given, and if we call one of these functions with the new keyword, then something special happens. It will create an object, which it will bind to this, and it will assign the things there, and it will return this newly created object. That's kind of what JavaScript gives us in terms of classical inheritance. It's this prototype of inheritance. So I have my animal that can say, hello, my name is Bello. Now the one thing we want to do usually with classical inheritance is inherit. So we would like to do something like the dog that extends the animals and then teach the dog how to bark. And that's something JavaScript cannot do. There's no such concept easily in there. And most frameworks around kind of came around solving this problem because, I mean, when we work, usually we don't need this inheritance, but as soon as you get into a bigger framework, this inheritance kind of is still something that we know very well and that helps us work. And so we have this, for example, for the model of Backbone, which you can extend, and you can teach it to say things, and it will return you an animal. And then you can define a dog, which is an animal that's extended. So you create an animal by extending a model, and then you create a dog by extending the animal, and you have this inheritance stuff that works in here. Yeah, and then you can call, so what it returns, what this extend returns is just a function, which is again a constructor function, and you can call it with the new keyword. So this also, does this kind of make sense? Okay. So the way this stuff is implemented is pretty simple. So Backbone is actually these 4 models, classes, the model, the router, the collection, and the view, and those all have this extend function, and this extend function, if you look at the source code, is something a bit weird. It returns a child. The child is created by this inherits function, and it's really interesting to find out how that works, but that's another talk. And if you're interested in it, I would recommend reading this book, which is really an interesting book, and everything's explained Anyway, so that's just because we're going to use the new keyword, and lots of JavaScript people who have been doing JavaScript in the last few years are not used to the new keyword. That's why it's like this. But we're here to talk about Backbone.js. So Backbone.js is an MVC framework, and it has, as such, roots like most MVC frameworks have. And if we want to look at how Backbone.js implement the roots, so roots are basically the thing that you have a URL and you translate it into some function called the roots. The router will do this work for you. So the way you create a root is, or a router, is that you take the Backbone router, you extend it, and you add the roots you want to add, and the roots consist of like the hashes you will have in the URL that will be mapped to functions. So for example, if you have nothing in the URL, so the empty URL, it will go to the index controller, and it will just call this function that we define in there. You can then have, for example, this root that takes this weird thing with a colon query, and what it does, it will translate your URL to a function call, passing it the query string. So this is kind of a placeholder for anything you put in there. The same like with the show of any ID. So that's basically how the router works. There's also a thing where you can have multiple placeholders, of course, and one big wildcard that will match anything that follows. Once you have defined your router constructor function, you just create a new instance of it. You don't even have to assign it anywhere. You just create it, and you tell Backbone to start history, which will actually start the application. So that's basically how you do start your application. You define your router, you make an instance of it, and you start, and that's it. And I will just show you what happens if you do exactly this and you add a console log just to all the controllers. If I manage to get back here, where is my? Okay, so in here I have these roots I showed you, and now if I go to Q question mark backbone, oh, I have to see the console, sorry. Where's my mouse? That's not easy. Sorry. So, there we go. So if I go, if I trigger the same root, of course nothing happens. But if I go to show 42, 42 will be passed to this controller. If I search for Pierre in Zurich, it will just pass these two variables. If I go to download avatar Pierre large, it will just take this because that was a wildcard. And in here, I can actually type anything and edit whatever I want, and it will just call this function. So that's simply how you take the URLs and you match them to roots. That's basically it. That's how you get the project started. Anyway. And now before I continue, I could also look at the application we're going to build. I built this one I started yesterday afternoon and finished in the evening, so it's quite a simple thing to write. The thing I wanted to do is just, I was looking for a simple idea. It's just some commenting system. We have some comments in here, and if you add a new comment, say, and the email which I use for the avatars, yeah. That's not going to work as an avatar. Add a comment, boom. It just adds this, okay, yeah. So it didn't reload the page, it just added this new comment. I'll show you how this is done. Good. So MVC stands for Model View Controller, and a model, again, like everything else in Backbone, is nothing else than a class. And now we want to create a model. So the model is what contains the data of your application, where the entire business logic is in. If you want to, it's the abstraction of your database, kind of, right? So your comments, which you put into the database, will have a model to which you can talk, you can save, you can load from. So we want to create a comment model, which is done simply by doing a backbone.model.extend. And once we have one such model, we can create a new comment by calling the constructor function with new comment and passing it some variables. And of course, like it's a comment, so there's a name, there's an email address, and there's a text, and that's it. And we already have this model going. Now, what we can also do with this, this model is to just create a new comment and set the variables, the attributes afterwards. So I created a comment, and then I said set, and then name, Pierre, email, Pierre Spring. So you can do that afterwards. You can modify your model however you want, and you can get out the data from it. Everything is stored under the models attributes, but you should never access it directly because this might change. This is kind of the signature of the class you should use. And now, of course, we have our model, which is in memory, which we just created, but we kind of want to persist this. And to persist it, we just call new comment, like we have our comment and we call save. But for now, Backbone has no clue what to do with this model, right? We just we told it, okay, this is a model, create a new one, but if you save it, it doesn't know, should I go to the database, where should I go? So we have to teach Backbone where to store stuff. And that's done very simply. If you use a RESTful API, you can just, when you extend the model, tell it where the URL is, if it's a RESTful API, and everything works. And it's already saving where it should, and it's already loading from there if you want to do that. But in my example, which I just built, I didn't want to build an API because I would still be writing the API instead of giving the talk to it. So I use this plugin, which is the Backbone local storage, which will just replace, instead of having a URL, we store to the local storage of the browser. And the way we are doing it here, so you just have to load in this additional library, and you can say, tell the model that it's persisting to the local storage, where you have like this store, which is the local storage store that's given by the library, and you pass it to the model, and that's it. You can save. Next, what we want to do is also persist the date. So as you saw here, it said like 8 hours ago, a few seconds ago, etc., etc. So we have to keep the date somewhere, and this we can do during the initialization phase. So this function initialize is always called whenever a new model is initialized. And what we're doing here is that we're checking if the options that are passed to the constructor function contains a date, and if not, we just set this date. And the way we set it is just like this, set date, and then I use this library, which is my favorite datetime library in JavaScript. And I get the date, and I do a toString, and I save it in there. Like moment.js, it's quite practical if you like this one, but there's many others. So that's basically what you use initialize for, to kind of add maybe some stuff that you need to add, or you can even bind events, but we'll see that later. And now, if we want to look at what happens, we have to display the date as well. So eventually we will pass the model to some view and to some template. And we will have to display this date, and the best place to have this logic is to have it on the model itself. So we can also add a new method that's called getDisplayDate, which will just get the date, which we persisted in the beginning, and then return the formatted date. So it's fairly straightforward, and it's pretty much like we're used to work with models even in the backend. And the result we get is, once we create a new comment, we do a get display date, and it just returns a few seconds ago. That's it. Are there any questions until here? Good. So, now we've seen the models, but the models are rarely alone. So like you have a set of models, like I have n comments on my blog post. And the way we bundle these comments is that we put them into a collection. And the collection itself is again a backbone collection that you extend. We tell the collection what its model is. So if it fetches from the database somewhere a JSON object, it knows, okay, I have to create new comment models with it. And then also I tell it where to persist to and where to get the data from, which is the local storage. Usually, if you write your own if you write an application, you have a URL to some REST API.
Sorry, but like, what is the local storage?
Oh, I'm sorry.
There's a couple of that database that I don't.
Okay, in HTML5 there is this different APIs that you have now for JavaScript, and one of them is a local storage. And so within a domain, which like I, for example, used this Backbone.js domain for my demo. Within this domain, I can store up to 5 megabytes of key value pairs, where the values are strings. And then what we usually do is that we JSON encode data, put it in there, and get it out. So it's just a very simple way to store data into your browser session.
And is this available from like the developer tools and so on? You can see the status of the database?
I think you can. Okay. So if you go to resources, I think it's in resources, you have the local storage, and here you see like all the stuff that I have in there.
Okay, good, thank you.
So we have this this collection which will just contain some models. As I said, it extends. I tell which model it uses, and I persist to the local storage. What am I trying to do here? I'm sorry. So I'm trying to show how it works. So I create this new comment collection class, as I did before. Then I create a new instance of it. And as soon as I do a fetch, it will go to your API, or in my case to the local storage, and fetch all the comments that have been in there. And then I can just iterate over them. And what Backbone.js does, it includes a library called _JS. Does anyone know underscore? Okay, so it's kind of a library that tries to do the same as prototype, but without mixing right into the native object. So it extends the native objects. And so it adds this each function so that they're proxied into the collection. And there's many other ones. So you can see on the documentation that you have each, you have filter, you have map, you have reduce. So you have access to pretty much everything that has to do with collections and underscore on the collections of Backbone. And so you can just iterate over them and do something, basically. Now let's see how we can like workflow our data. So if we create new data, so we create a new comment model. So we have this model class, create a new comment, blah, 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 and then we save it, which will persist it either to local storage or on your server. And then we have to still add it to the collection that is live right now, because the collection is not going to refresh itself. So we save it to the server and we add it to the collection. And that's what I just said. And then, like all these 3 steps you can do in one simple step. You can just take a collection and say create, and it will do all these 3 things. Create a new comment, save it, and add it to the collection. The reason we're doing all this stuff is then to work with it. And to work with it, the most important concept in Backbone is how events function. So you have a set of different events that can be triggered on comments, on models and collections, and you can bind to them. So you can either bind to the model or to the collection here. So for example, I can, onto a new comment, I can bind to a change. A change would be, for example, if I change the name. So I take the comment and I do a set and change the name. This will trigger a change event, and the callback function will get as an attribute, as a parameter, the model that has been changed. And then you can do the same but namespace, so just trigger events if the name has been changed or if the email has been changed, and then the callback function not only gets the model, but it also gets the attribute as a string that has been modified. The same goes with comment collections. You have two types of events that are triggered. You have the reset event. That one gets triggered if you completely replace the content of a collection. So you have your collection, you do a fetch, you get a set of new comments, and you replace everything that's in there, so that triggers a reset. And here the callback function gets the entire collection, and then you can iterate over this collection and do whatever you want with it. On the other hand, the comment collection can also trigger an add. So if you take your collection and just add new comments to it, then it will trigger this one and you get them all. We'll see in a while why all this makes sense. Yeah.
In this case, you're binding to the instances of the models. Is it possible to bind in a class to avoid having to call bind for every new comment that you create, every new instance?
I don't know. I guess not. Don't know if that makes sense.
Well, imagine a new comment, for example, you'll always want to bind something to the change event.
Yeah, it might be that there is some, like usually there is, I could look it up in 2 minutes, and we can look it up after. The amazing thing about Backbone actually is that if you have a question like that, it takes you 5 minutes to find out because you have the annotated source code. I'll show you that in the end, which is the best documentation you have. You have the documentation on one side and the source code, and you would find out really fast. I just never had this use case, so I can't tell you. Anyway, so this is how actually your data providers, the collections, and the models will communicate with the rest of the application. Every time you have a modification, like we keep everything separated. The data is separated from everything else. We will pass instances of the collections or the models to the views. We'll see later how that happens. But that's about it. And then whenever we trigger events on the data, whenever the data is modified, things will happen. But there's no direct link, like you're not reacting directly. That's kind of the beauty of the whole thing. There's things I didn't talk about in the model, like you can have validation, so on set or on creation that it validates. Like there's many things, I just can't go into everything. I'm just explain what we need for our little application. But then again, as I said, maybe I'll show you the documentation, so believe me that it's really nice. So where is it? So you've got everything here, and it's very small. So everything the model can do is in here. And so you, for example, you have the documentation of set. Everything is explained, and if you want to know how these things really work, like you can go to the annotated source code, which you have the source code of the entire Backbone project, which is really small and explanations. Good. Losing myself. So we've seen pretty much the models. There's a bit more to it, but not much more. And the collections. So now the view, in the V that stands for view. If you're used to backend development, usually the view meant templating. Like it's kind of a template, like it's Smarty if it's PHP, but it's not much more. You don't really have logic in the view. And this is a bit different in Backbone.js. Templating is templating, and it's called templating. It has nothing to do with the view. And the view has the entire logic that has to do with the user interface. This might seem wrong because on the back end it's always a bad idea to do logic in the view, but here it makes sense because the view actually has a lot of logic because the user interacts with the view. doesn't interact with anything else. So everything that has to do with interaction logic will be in the view. So the view again is nothing else than this class that you extend. Then you can create a new view, and that's it. And if you create a new view, you could look on this element property, and the element property already contains a div element. This div element is not in the DOM yet, it's just there, and you can use it to put things in there. If you want to change the element that you use, you can actually give it a tag name or a class name or an ID in the constructor, like when you extend the constructor, and you would get at that moment a P element with this ID and class. What you can also do, but it's not really recommended, is instead of having one element that's not in the DOM yet, you can just choose one element from the DOM and assign it to your view, and then everything you do with this element will be done directly. But usually you don't do that because you don't want to reflow. Do you understand the concept of reflow? Like the concept of reflow is every time you change something to the DOM has to redraw, like the browser has to redraw everything. And what you want to do is actually use this element of this model, of this view object, and modify it, add your things, add your lines of comments, etc. And only when you're done, you attach it to the DOM. That's basically the idea, how you work with it. And if it comes all together, we get all this code. And once we are done with that, we already have the entire list we had on the site that listed all the comments. So we have our comment view, and it has an initialize function. Again, like when you create your new view, this function will be called with options that we will pass. And the first thing we do is that we create a new method to our view that's called list row template. And the list row template just uses underscore template. The underscore it compiles some template into a JavaScript function, and that's just templating, right? Like you have somewhere in your HTML you have a template that's usually it's a script tag, but with type text, I think it is. And in there you have your template with placeholders. You pass this, you get this string, you pass it to your template engine, which can be underscore template, or it can be mustache, or whatever you want to use, jQuery or whatever. And it will create a function, and then this function you can use to generate your HTML. So that's the template, very simple. You can keep it aside, and underscore, it comes bundled usually with Backbone, so that's what I use here. So I create this template function and assign it to my view, and then I bind to comment collections. So I showed you before comment collections that trigger events, and the way we get these comment collections into the view is that before we create an instance of the view, of course we create an instance of our collection, and we just pass the collection into the view. That's it, very simple. Create a view, pass it the collection, and in the collection bind to the events. So I say if the collection is being reset, then please render the rows. The third parameter just means that this will be bound to this. This is very difficult to explain because this is a dumb word. And the same here, if the collection is being added, just one model, we render a single row. And that's basically all we have to do in the initialize phase. We create a template that compiles some template into a function and bind to the two events, and that's it. Later on, at some stage, someone writes a comment, and that triggers an add event. At this moment, this render row is being called. It gets the comment model that's being created. So we did a new comment written by Pierre, email, blah, boom. That's this one. And what we do is that we take this list row template. So now we have this because of this. We take this template we created, which is a function we pass it an object, and in the object we say the comment is this comment model we got to JSON. To JSON we just take the attributes and make a nice object out of it without anything else. So you can modify it, you can do anything with it, it doesn't matter. You can also use it then to stringify the entire thing to the system. And that's basically it. It takes calls the template and then prepends the element which we have. This element gets prepended the rendered model. End of the story. And we get a new model in front of it. Yeah, that's the whole thing. On the other hand, if we have a reset, so the entire collection is being fetched, at that moment we render all the rows, which is another function, and here we get the collection. This time we can each over it, and when we each over it, the easiest way I did, it's not really clean, because if that's already attached and we do a lot of reflows, it's just don't copy this code, but it's simpler to explain. So I just rendered the row n times for all the elements that are in the collection.
Yeah, doesn't that fail to clear contents of this .el in the case of a reset?
That fails, yes. You're right. So one line missing here. But yeah, usually, I mean, I've personally never. You can reset yourself. Like there's a function collection.reset and then pass it something. I've never done it. Usually, the reason like I think I never even cleared it myself, because usually you do just a fetch in the beginning. Yeah. So you have your collection. You pass it to the view. Yeah, I should put that behind the attaching because of the reflow. But then you call fetch, and that's it. And that would be the only time you have this reset being called, and only after will you get ads. Hopefully, except if the user's super fast. So that triggers the rendering of the rows. And yeah, that was all the listing. Now, on the other side, we have the form. And the form is in itself, again, a view. I don't show the initialize and the rendering initialize. There's just, it passes some stuff around, and the rendering just renders the form itself, so it's static HTML. There's just one form. And it has a form with a submit button. And so there is this thing you can define when you extend your view, that's the events property. And it uses event delegation. So it will, on this dot element, it will have an event delegator that will get, for example, all the submits and filter if it's a form. And if it notices some submit on this dot element, it will call new comment. So it's fairly simple. You have your view, you have this dot element, which you will eventually put somewhere in your HTML. And you can have event delegation on this, makes it very clean. And then if you have like this new comment function that's being called, it's really simple, so we just prevent the default, define some variables. Then here I just parse, I take the form, I serialize it as an array, and then I just put it into an options array so that it looks nice. I have email equals email name, blah, blah, blah. I create a new comment. Now I take the comment collection and I create the option. I create this new comment with the options, which does these three things: creating a model, saving it, and putting it into the collection. This will then trigger an add on the other view, but I don't care what happens in the other view, it just happens. And I clear the form. And that's basically how simple it was to write the application. Yeah. Any questions here? Okay. So, which leads us to the C, as in controller, and there is no controller in Backbone. So, but it's an MVC. No, but there's like, okay, I'll show you later. There's an open source book being written on Backbone.js. And they have this whole entire discussion on is it an MVC or not, and what's the controller and whatnot. But back in the day, like in the beginning of Backbone, the router used to be called controller. But it's not really right, because the controller is actually the thing that takes different models, takes different templates and views and puts them together and adds the entire application logic. But in our case, we have like this, in the router we decide who gets to be friends with whom, so we take the collections and models and the views, but the entire user logic, like user interface logic, is in the view. So our controller is split into two. It's in the view for everything that's user interface, and in the router for everything that's like make friends between models and templates. So yeah, that's basically the function. All you need to do to write this. Are there any questions? That was really short, wasn't it? I think I don't have more. I can go into the source code if you have any questions.
How do you deal with globalization, localization?
Okay, so nice. But I don't have it in here. So what I use usually is require.js for my modules. So I can show you. I'll show you just a little bit. Who knows require.js? Okay, so that might be interesting to hear about as well. No, that's not what I want to display. Just give me a second until I get to understand how my computer works. There we go. Oh God, this is horrible. Or is it? Backbone. So do you see something here? Okay. By the way, everything is on GitHub, which I did. I'll give you the link later. So you can look at all this code later. So in my index file, I have all the libraries I use: jQuery, Moment.js, MD5 to create like the avatars, etc., etc. And then I just use this require.js thing. Like purists use everything in require.js, even the libraries, but I'm lazy, so I think libraries may be in the global scope. Everything else will be handled in. And this is kind of a way to encapsulate your code into modules. What it does is, okay, you have just this source, which it loads, and then it says data main, JS require app. So let's look at what's in there. JS require app. And in there, I actually have this code that says, please require the router and then call this function. So it will go into the folder require / and get this router. Once it has loaded this router, it will pass it to the function and call this callback function. So it's kind of an asynchronous JavaScript loading library thingy-majiggy. So it just loads my code in there. I will get to the internationalization eventually, and if I forget, you have to remind me. So yeah, that's how I kickstart my application here. The good thing here is that, okay, I can have my router just in one single file here. Where do I say that it should not be? So, and here's the same stuff. So I create a router here, which I return eventually. So that's the thing that gets returned to my app here when I require it here. Does this make sense? Good. So, and I will use a collection, a list view, and a form view. So these I require before calling this function. So they will get asynchronously loaded. I will get back the objects, and then I can work with them. And they will be in the scope of this function, and then I can start to do my router. And this application has just one single root. It's just this common thing that I showed you, so it has nothing except a single root where it has an index controller. And the index controller does exactly what I showed you before. It takes the comment collection, creates an instance of it, it takes the comment list view, creates an instance of it by injecting it, the comment collection instance. The form view injects the comment collection instance. So in the form view, we use it to do the create. In the list view, we use it to get out the data and list it, and bind to add, and bind to reset. Then I attach my elements wherever I want to attach them, and I call comment collection fetch. And if I would do it right, of course, I do, I do the fetch beforehand, because then it does all the templates, it goes over all the templates and then only inserts the stuff into the DOM without doing too much, reflows. And the same with like maybe the comments collection. So I say, please get me this stuff. So it goes to look into the folder collections comment. And in here we have the same thing. I needed the model, and the model was loaded. Once it's loaded, it asynchronously calls this function that will return what? That will return the model, the collection. Does it make sense? Okay. Now, I'll just go into highly NDA code. Like, it's not released yet, so please, please don't tell anyone I showed you. Where am I? Oh. So that's the one project I'm working on right now. So we're redoing the mobile web page for local.ch, which is some phone book imaging. And now I get into this localization thing. Require.js has different plugins which are practical. So if you look at the view, for example, the view requires some text. So these things that are before the bang mean, okay, that's a plugin. So it will asynchronously fetch this file, but as a text, not as a JavaScript that's executed. So I can go and get the templates and store. That's pretty practical because I have all my templates that are in here that are simple templates with, okay, some stuff that's being rendered out. And here I have this weird translation thing, and that comes from an internationalization plugin of Require.js. In here, in Require.js, you have this plugin that you can require. Okay, let me show you the views. Did I have one? Here it's just going to load, for example, this API file or object, but in the language that's in your browser right now. You can also specify the language and change it over time. And within this API file that's being required, I just say, okay, if your browser is in French, then please get me FR. That's just the strings I use to create the API links. And then the entire application is being translated here, where you have all the translation strings, and then for every language, once the client decides to start doing it, they can translate it. Does this kind of make sense? And then when I bootstrap the application, I load the strings, I get the strings, and I pass them to my weird handmade translation function. That's all. So it's fairly simple, and it automatically detects the language of your phone, falling back to the root if no language is given. So I have the strings, and I can enable or disable any language I want. And you can go further, where you can say, oh, I want different translation files for German Swiss or German German, and just always goes back to the one it can use. But it has nothing to do with Backbone itself. So Backbone will not provide anything for that. Any other questions?
Question on Require.
Yeah.
So for example, the loading of the templates there, does it do a request to the server for every individual template?
Yeah.
And is there a sort of compiled mode
Yeah.
where you can put all your templates in a single?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you're doing that, you just write me a mail and I send you my build script. It's just ugly. I will never put that build script into the public because I'm ashamed of it, but it works. So the way my build script works, it goes over the index file and it actually reads what's in here.
Yeah.
And then once it notices there's some require stuff, then that uses Node, like you need Node to be installed, and then it compiles the entire thing into one single file. So I compile everything here into a single file. I do, because this is mobile, I do some really ugly stuff, like inline all the images into the CSS base64 encoded, etc. But yeah. So for development, it's super practical. You just create a new file and it's in there, and then if you hit deploy, it's there. That's called r.js. So on the require homepage, you have everything documented. It's fairly well documented. Everything's here. So I think it's here. Yeah, or not. You'll find it. Anyway. Anything else?
Another question from me.
Yeah.
Have you tried other MVC frameworks, and how did Backbone compare?
No.
Okay. But
So-
Backbone's good.
So no, I just like so I did it like most of the people do. I wrote my own one and it worked. It sucked. Then I went over to something totally over-engineered, Sencha Touch, because I was targeting only the mobile, and that had like it was a catastrophe. And then I ended up with Backbone because lots of people talk about it. But I would like to look into Sprout Core, because that looks fairly interesting. And it's kind of, I think they're the two most talked about right now. But yeah. The thing about Backbone is that it's really, it's really interesting if you work with designers that will deliver you with HTML and CSS. Then it's really cool because you don't need to do anything. Whereas if you target something that has to look native, or if you want to do something that's just a simple admin backend, maybe you're better off with Dojo, right? But they're very different. Backbone is like the minimal thingamajiggy without widgets. Dojo is the huge thing, or XJS that will give you all the widgets and application building. And to build this one, I'm really bad at designing. And to build this one, do you recognize the buttons? Yes. So I never used that before yesterday, and I actually managed to learn about Twitter Bootstrap, write the application in about 4.5 hours. So it's like you really get it fast. And maybe some links. Let's see. So yeah, if you Google for Backbone.js, the first 4 hits are the most important ones. You see they're all used. Where's the 5th one? I don't care about. The first one is the official documentation. As I showed you, if you want information about all the available functions, it's here. And the annotated source code is really helpful. That's where I get most information out of. That's the annotated source code. Then you have this Backbone Fundamentals project that started like several weeks ago, like maybe months or so. And it's just grown into this very good online free book that will, like it's just a README markdown thing that's explaining everything about Backbone. Then there's this one video that's really good. Like if you wanna sell Backbone to someone and it's like, oh, it's not interesting, tell them to watch that video. That's what got me sold. _JS is this library that's bundled with it. It also uses jQuery, so like Backbone does what it does best, like it does very small things, and then it uses jQuery for all the Ajax stuff and the DOM stuff, and it uses underscore for everything that's more like extending JavaScript objects. And this is the repository. My username on GitHub is Caillou, which French-speaking people know how to write. has to do with Pierre. So yeah, the rules are in here, and the comments are, the second application is in here. And the cool thing is that it's really a good thing to get started if you want to use this, have this entire require.js stuff. It's really simple once you have it, but it took me like 2 days to get it together. But the the Backbone fundamentals guys, they go a bit further. They're more extreme into like, they don't want any object to be global, but I don't necessarily agree with what they do. Not because I'm sure what they do is better, but I think you tend to lose time. That's it.